All right. Hi, everybody. It's good to see you. So if you were here a couple of months ago, last time I shared with you how important the mind is to your well-being. And we also talked about the different symptoms of anxiety and depression, so what it can look like and how it can manifest itself both physically and emotionally and psychologically in lots of different ways. And then last week, you heard the first part of this series about healing the mind, where Dr. Mina Merholm talked about the different ways that mental health treatment can help, and how specifically the church has been actively working towards a lot of different ways of reaching out to our community, whether that's on the West Coast, they've got a network of providers they work with, or up in New York, they've got the mental health clinic, in the Southern Diocese, they've got the rehab center. The church is actively working towards, helping its community members recognize that we all can fall into the difficulties of mental illness, whether that's anxiety or depression, ADHD, more severe things like bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, things like that. We all can struggle. So we're going to continue that conversation by focusing on your thoughts and how they impact you, because a lot of times we're not even aware of how we're thinking. We kind of just go through the day and we have no idea what kinds of thoughts have been entering our mind or influencing us kind of throughout. So to give you an example of that, the other day, I started rearranging the furniture in one of the rooms in our house. It just kind of happened without warning. I didn't tell anybody I was going to do it. I just started to move things around. And my husband, who knows me better than I know myself a lot of times, he just kind of stood in the doorway smiling and watching me patiently and said, "Is this your way of getting out your anxiety?" Because he knew that I had a meeting the next day that I was feeling really nervous about. I was afraid of what I was going to have to share in that meeting. I had some bad news I had to reveal, and I was feeling really nervous and anxious and worked up about it. But I didn't put the two things together until he pointed it out to me. And it finally clicked. Because what he also knew is that as a child, I used to rearrange the furniture in my bedroom. It was my space. It was the only space I had control of as a kid, and it was all little me could do whenever I felt stuck or stressed or angry or stressed out about something. I would just move things around until it made me feel better. So knowing those things, he was able to piece that together, but I was kind of operating pretty automatically with my thoughts. So we abide by this really large fallacy that thoughts just happen to us. They come to us, they arrive at our doorstep, and we, being the hospitable people we are, we just open the door and we let them all in. Like we have to. We can't turn them down, we can't keep the door closed. We let all the different kinds of thoughts in. We let them stay as long as they want to. We entertain them. We believe them without using any kind of filter or guard to figure out what thoughts we should allow or not allow, what's helpful and what's not helpful. So the way your thoughts impact your mood is if you spend all day thinking about the horrors of the world and all the different news headlines, you're going to feel pretty crummy at the end of the day. You're going to feel pretty sad and upset and pretty jaded about the world. If you've spent all day thinking about a really fun vacation or trip that you're taking in a few weeks, you're going to feel pretty excited and motivated and really happy. So do you have an open door policy with your thoughts? Do you just let all of them in without any kind of monitoring or paying attention to the things that cross your path, the little signs, the little articles we read, the little posts that pop up for us? St. Paul tells us, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. So while you're allowed to have all the thoughts you choose to let in, not all of them might be helpful. So during the course of a day, you have anywhere from 50 to 70,000 thoughts, which translates to about 35 to 48 thoughts a minute. So do you have any idea what the 40-ish thoughts you just had the last minute were while I was talking? Do you have any idea what just went through your mind within those 60 seconds, or did it just happen? If you can't identify what those thoughts were, how are you going to be able to evaluate them? How will you know whether they were helpful or unhelpful, whether they were healthy for you, or whether they're actually making you more anxious, more depressed, more sad, more down about yourself. All right, so I want you to think for just a minute. I want you to consider depression and anxiety on the opposite ends of the spectrum of the idea of control. So a lot of times people with depression feel like they have no sense of control over what happens to them. They are convinced that they can't really control anything. Life happens to them. They aren't an active changer in life. They get this sense that they have no choice and a sense of helplessness. People with anxiety, on the other hand, are at the opposite end of the spectrum with a really high sense of control. They work really hard to overly control their environment. There's a fear of losing that control. So they overthink things, and they find comfort in ruminating over something or worrying about it a lot of times, thinking that by thinking about it, that's a sense of control in and of itself. What's healthy is somewhere in between the two. It's learning to adapt a reasonable sense of control. So learning that there are things I can control, there are things in God's control, and there are things in the control of the other person that's also participating in whatever this event might be. It really is so perfectly summarized in that famous serenity prayer that Niebuhr wrote of, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. Being able to discern the difference between what is something I can control and that is worth working towards, and where am I kind of wasting my time by trying to control something that's really out of my hands. Our brains have a much easier time becoming wired towards negative events. So for example, during the course of a day, if you encounter 10 experiences, 5 of them are neutral, 4 of them are positive, and 1 of them is negative, you're most likely to remember that negative event at the end of the day before you fall asleep. Our brains are just kind of naturally wired that way. It comes out of survival, right? You want to remember that negative thing because it'll help you the next time to try to avoid it. It reduces risk and it can save your life, right, if it's a really actual negative thing that's worth worrying about. So remembering dangerous situations can keep you alive, which is why then it takes a lot of mental effort to try to purposefully remember the positive things or purposefully be present to the things that are going well in your life rather than focusing on the one thing that's not, or the couple of things that aren't. All right, I know I lost like 70% of you the moment I popped that picture up there, but I want you to bear with me for just a second. I promise it won't be a long science lesson. But in order to improve your brain, you have to understand how it works first. So different parts of your brain are responsible for different things. So for example, your prefrontal cortex, which is in the front here, it's responsible for your decision making. It's not fully developed in younger kids, which is why it doesn't make any sense to say something to them like, were you even thinking about what you just did? Because it hasn't developed yet. So yes, they were thinking, they just don't have the same ability to think that you do. Your basal ganglia is in the back, and that's involved in more habits and patterns of behavior that you're used to. So of this picture, I want you to pay the most attention to the dendrites. They're the branch-like things at the ends. And the reason I want you to pay attention to them is because you have a choice in changing that part. So these neurons, they communicate with each other in your brain through the neurotransmitters, right? They transmit messages, information, by connecting with one another. The more often you do something, the more dendrites that get built. All right, so when they connect, those dendrites, they can increase. The more often you do a behavior, the more often you have a thought, you can actually change the way the wiring in your brain. You create neural pathways. And the way I want you to think about a neural pathway is a little bit like this picture. So the more often you walk down a path in a grassy area, right, the more the grass kind of loses its way, and you start to pave kind of a dirt path. It becomes a lot easier to walk that path, and you can do it a lot faster, and you can walk the same way back and forth every single time because you've done it so many times. So that neural pathway, it works the same way. The more frequently you do something, the connection gets stronger and stronger, and the more you do the same thing over and over again, that connection gets faster and faster until it becomes automatic a lot of times. And that can be really helpful. So things like driving or riding a bicycle or reading, those have become pretty automatic for us. And that's helpful because it can preserve a lot of energy that the brain puts out. Because you don't want to purely be, 16 again driving. Now you're able to have a conversation with somebody else and do it. You do these things more automatically so it can preserve energy for the other things that you have to do in your day. Well, what happens when the paths, the neural pathways that you've formed are more negative, are more unhelpful automatic thoughts and behaviors that kind of just come to you pretty quickly without you even being able to change them? So unhelpful automatic things that we all engage in involve things like biting your nails when you're stressed, after having a hard day, immediately saying, I need a drink, yelling at somebody when you're angry, like a spouse or your kids. It's just the first thing you do. Oh, angry, yelling. It just becomes so automatic. Pulling out your cell phones to avoid something, right? We're in the middle of something, I don't feel like thinking about this, I just need a distraction. It just becomes so automatic, we do it. Other automatic thoughts that are really unhelpful, that we kind of do pretty instinctively almost sometimes, if you have a negative sense of self, if you're more prone to depression or already worrying about things, like every time your spouse is late, you think of a car accident. You automatically assume something bad has happened to them. Your brain has a harder time generating, maybe there was traffic, or maybe something happened, maybe they had to stop by the store. Sometimes a person's late to your house, you automatically think, they don't like me. They're trying to spend as little time as possible. Think about the automatic thoughts that might be happening for the other person who's thinking, they just invited me out of obligation. I'll just go as late as I can so I don't have to trouble them. Imagine what that interaction is going to be like. That person with their automatic thoughts and this person with their automatic thoughts, and a complete miss of how the relationship can be and how healthy it could develop. So you have to start paying attention to these things that you do on autopilot without even questioning them, because you do have a choice. You choose what thoughts you allow into your mind and what you don't, and you choose how you want to think about different situations. And whether or not you get caught up in things like, I'm going to fail, or everyone's looking at me, or I always mess up, I look awful, I hate this part about me, I hate that part. You have a choice. You're in control of your thoughts, and you decide what you want to think about. And that's a lot of responsibility. God gave you the choice. So don't say, I can't stop thinking about it. Instead, you can say, I keep thinking about it. But you have a lot more control than you give yourself credit for, right? We teach our kids that they're responsible for their actions. And I'm telling you, you're responsible for your thoughts. You don't get to blame the other people or the other situations or events. So in Deuteronomy it says, today I've given you the choice between life and death, between blessings and curses. Now I call on heaven and earth to witness the choice you make. Oh, that you would choose life so that you and your descendants might live. It gets really hard to make that choice, to choose life, when you're already feeling down, or when you're already really worried and worked up about something and stressed. But in order to choose life, choosing to live, you have to make the choice to live like the child of God that you are. Because so much of the time we derive our value from these fleeting things that come our way, whether that's how many likes that we have, or how many thumbs up, or whatever kinds of ways you derive your value from your boss at work, or from the fleeting things that your child can say to you. One day, Mommy, you're so great. The next day, I hate you. If you derive your value from that, you're going to be on this roller coaster of emotions where thoughts are going to be coming in and out all the time. But we're highly esteemed children of the King of Kings. And that's what our true value is. And that's so much more consistent than deriving our value from all these other places. When we struggle with symptoms of depression and anxiety, that vision can get really fuzzy. It can obstruct your view from being able to see your true value. We start to personalize things. Oh, I know he was talking about me. He left the room as soon as I walked in. Or he made the party on that day in specific because he knew I was going to be out of town. Stop. Stop thinking this way. Stop choosing to think this way, It's only making you feel worse. So how do we do that? How do we change those? The first step is to be aware of those thoughts. Literally write them down. Go through the course of a day, writing down the thoughts that come to your mind. And at the end of the day, take a look. What did I just write? What are some themes that pop up? Wow, look how negatively I talk about myself. Wow, look how much I really nag on that coworker. I spend so much of my day thinking about how much I can't stand them rather than actually doing my work. So the next part is to identify kind of what are those automatic thoughts? What kinds of things are repeating? Which things did you keep writing down over and over again? And that's where you know that's the thing that's tripping you up. Or maybe you already know what part you're already struggling with, what area is already difficult for you. Like every time I spend time with this person, I feel so self-conscious and I am so worried about what they think or what assumptions they're making of me. And examine what those thoughts are and where they come from. A lot of times it's really hard to do that on our own. So sometimes it takes another person to call you out on that. And we're not always willing to hear that from a spouse or a friend who's probably already told it to us 5 or 6 times. So it may be helpful to hear it from somebody else who isn't biased, who isn't already a part of your circle. The next part is going to be to challenge that thought. So how true is it? The best test is going to be, would I say this to somebody else? So how true is that automatic thought that you just had that kind of just came to you of, I'm going to fail? Would you ever say that to a friend? You're totally going to fail. Or, I look awful. Would you say that to somebody else? You do. You look awful. You're right. There's nothing you can do. We would never say that to somebody else. So don't say it to yourself. Challenge that thought. Am I really going to fail? Or am I going to do pretty good, but there are going to be a couple of mistakes I make, and that's not going to be exactly what I want. One of my other favorites is, something bad's going to happen. I know that it is. Okay, but you're not a prophet, so you don't know that something bad's going to happen. Could it? Yes. It's possible. But what if instead you filled your thoughts with what else could happen besides something bad? Could turn out pretty good, could be just okay, it could be something everybody forgets. That would be okay. So then you have to think about what's a more helpful truth, right? What's a more helpful thing to figure? Because if you just tell yourself, stop thinking about that, stop, don't say that again, stop telling yourself that, it's actually not going to work, and what's going to happen is it's going to backfire, and it's going to come even more often. So just saying to stop thinking about it isn't effective enough. You have to replace it with something else. You have to figure out what's a better way of thinking about this. I'm not telling you to walk around and be like Pollyanna and, everything's wonderful. Yes, nothing is ever bad going to happen to me. I'm not saying go to the opposite extreme. I can't do that either. But at least be realistic with a real truth rather than the false truths that you've come to believe over time. What's a more real truth? Am I going to fail at everything? No. I'm not going to be great at everything, but I'm going to be successful at some things. All right. St. Paul tells us, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, whatever things are lovely, whatever things are of good report, if there's any virtue and if there's anything praiseworthy, meditate on these things. So Aaron Beck is the father of cognitive behavioral therapy, the idea of changing your thoughts and your behaviors to become more healthy. But if you spend a lot of time really looking at this verse, St. Paul really was the inventor of thought changing. He really was teaching us, this is what we need to meditate on. The things that are good, the things that are lovely, not the things that are horrible, not the things that are going wrong in your life. But if you meditate on those good things that are true, right? Not make up these, things just to make yourself feel better, but the things that are true, that are good, that is what you need to meditate on instead. Right before that, he had just said, be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer, supplication with thanksgiving. Let your requests be made known to God. That thanksgiving piece is so important because when we focus on what we're grateful for rather than our loss, again, it changes your mindset, it changes your mood, and it helps you see everything else through that lens instead. I had a couple of years ago, I met with some parents who'd lost their child. He died suddenly in the middle of the night. There was nothing anybody could do about it, nothing that they could suspect. And the way that the father had said, as he was talking about the way that he was coping with this loss of the child, they had 3 children. They lost one and had 2 others. He said, I can't forget that I'm still a father to 2 other children. I'm still thankful that I have my 2 other children to continue to parent. What a turnaround. Rather than sitting and ruminating in the loss of their son, and he grieved the loss of that son, but instead focusing on the 2 other living children he had. It made such a difference in his ability to cope with that loss. I also love the part that comes afterwards where he says, the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds. So that's a little bit like what I was talking about earlier with the thoughts. Don't just let everybody in. Don't just have this open door policy where there's just it's free flow of stuff. It goes in, it goes out. I just open up whatever website I want to and read all the news articles that make me feel terrible at the end of the day. Have a filter. Be on guard. All right, so what does getting help look like? I'm going to ask you to do me a favor, and I want everybody to take out their cell phones and save this number. And I'm going to tell you why. Because you might not need it, but one day, in 2 months, in a year, in 5 years, you might be in the middle of a conversation with somebody who does need it. And maybe there's somebody who really wants to take out their phone and save the number, but they're too ashamed to do it because they're afraid of what somebody else will think of them. So if everybody is supportive and everybody takes it out and everybody saves it, nobody has to feel ashamed. And you might be the person who's helping somebody else because you don't know who's going to cross your path. So a lot of times I find that the struggle comes in figuring out, okay, I've identified I do have anxiety. It really gets in my way. I am functioning, right? Like I'm getting out of bed, I'm going to work, but it really, it keeps me down. It makes me really unhappy in the middle of, spending time with my family, or it makes it hard for me to concentrate on my work. Got it. I figured it out. I've got anxiety. Now what? Well, what we talked about was just one little nugget of how to change your thoughts, but that's not going to do it, to be honest. So how do you actually get the help that you need? And I'm going to talk a little bit more practically about how to do that. So if you have insurance, you want to look up your mental health benefits or your behavioral health benefits. If there's a specific person that you want to see, you'll want to ask if you have out-of-network benefits if they don't take your insurance. So when you're looking for counseling, you want to look for psychologists, social workers, licensed professional counselors. There's probably a couple of others that would be really helpful too. If you're ready for medication, you can talk to your primary care physician or a psychiatrist, and it can make a big difference. And we talked last time, I'm going to repeat again, right? It's not any different than needing to take something for your blood pressure or your cholesterol. We wouldn't poo-poo that idea. Don't do it to this either. It helps you. Sometimes there's a chemical imbalance. Or sometimes you just need something to get you started until you're able to take control of your thoughts. The other piece I want to address are some of the myths that are involved in going to counseling in the first place. So what is it actually like? a lot of times people will say, oh, well, they're going to tell my employer. No, your records are confidential. Oh, but I have a security clearance. Nope, still not going to say anything unless you give them permission. And then even if you do, it's usually as little information as necessary. What happens in therapy? So, like I said, if you've been struggling for a few years, this little strategy isn't going to cut it. It can give you a good kickstart, but it's not going to be enough. But if you've been struggling for years, it can be a real great space where someone is listening to everything you have to say. And that's really hard to get, especially nowadays. Even with people that love us, even with friends, we feel like we're a burden to them if we take up more than several minutes of the time talking just about ourselves. And we get tripped up into all these other automatic thoughts of, oh, they probably don't want to hear this again. Oh, this is like the 10th time I've had to call them this week to tell them this. Nobody wants to hear this. So it's a space where there isn't that judgment. You don't have to worry about that burden. Or you can at least talk about the burden. You can say how hard it is to sit there and just talk about yourself the entire time. I see counseling as a sacred space between three people. So it's the counselor, the person who's going in, and God. And he really is present. And you get to bring him into the room. And you can pray before your sessions. I pray before a session. And he can be in the midst to guide it, which leads you to the next question, right? So does my therapist have to be a Christian? I'm going to be very truthful. It's none of your business. Because you're there to talk about you, not about them. It's not about what faith they are. In fact, a lot of times, knowing that your therapist is a Christian can actually make it a lot harder to talk about some of the things you already feel guilty about, because you're operating with the assumption that they probably disapprove of this behavior. Whereas if you have no idea what your counselor believes or doesn't believe, it's not part of what you're there to work on anyway. And so you get to just have this free flow of thoughts, which is the way that it's supposed to be. So it doesn't have to be a Christian, but it does have to be a good therapist, because if they're good, they're going to respect your values and beliefs, and they're going to support them. But they will challenge them, and that's okay too. They're going to challenge the automatic things that you might do, the same way you should be challenging those automatic thoughts. So for example, if you go in and you say, I believe in confession, and so I go in twice a week because I think it's really important. And I spend like 2 hours there twice a week, and that's what I do. They might say, well, I respect your belief, and that may be really valuable, but to what degree has this become a crutch, a way that you're just relieving yourself of all of this guilt rather than truly utilizing it for its purpose? And that's a place where you get to really explore that, rather than automatically doing some of these behaviors you've gotten into. So, in the time I've spent kind of hearing all the deepest, darkest secrets that people talk about that they feel like they can't share with anybody else, what I want to leave you with is the person that you can't stand being around is also a hurting person, just like you're a hurting person. And they're just trying to cope with their own struggles. And maybe they misdirect it, and maybe their automatic thoughts are getting in their way. So the person with low self-esteem who's struggling with their insecurities might come off as prideful and arrogant, or seeming like a jerk. They might just be really trying hard to hide all of their insecurities, and it comes out the wrong way. Or the person that creates a lot of drama, right? They're probably just hurting and feeling really alone. And they found that the only way to get that attention and care and compassion that they're desperately needing and looking for is by dramatizing a situation, by making it bigger than it seems, because it causes more reactions. Everybody's struggling on a different level, and by being understanding of kind of where I'm coming from, what I automatically thought of that face you just made, and what you're thinking about the face I just made and how that makes us turn away from each other rather than towards each other can make a really big difference. All right, so wrapping up. You're in charge of your thoughts. You are, whether you believe it or not. It's hard to do. But just try to be more aware of what goes on through your mind and how that's impacting your mood, how that's bringing you down and making you feel more depressed, or how it's making you more tense and more worried and escalating. The more you have one thought, it just kind of continues. Decide which ones you're going to discard. What are you going to get rid of, and what are you going to allow to stay? And create more of those healthier neural pathways. Again, the more you repeat a healthy behavior over and over and over again, your brain learns to just do it more automatically. Choose those healthy thoughts. Get the help if you need it, which honestly everybody could benefit from it. And be vulnerable with your loved ones. Because if I hadn't been vulnerable with the example I gave in the beginning, nobody would have called me out on it. Nobody would have been able to see through the ways that I'm kind of just on autopilot acting in life and coping with things. And glory be to God forever, amen.
Thank you so much, Naveen, Dr. Naveen.